Hey friends, Hannah Nicklin here, Hannah from the future in fact, because this podcast was recorded a few weeks ago, meaning that it predates Die Gute Fabrik's world premiere as part of Day of the Devs at Summer Games Fest, where we announced our brand new story-driven adventure game, Salt Sea Chronicles. There you go. That's a fanfare. Please do check it out, either on our socials, where we're Gute Fabrik, which is GUTEFABRIK, or by heading to saltseachronicles.com, or also write to Steam, where wishlistingers could help us find more people to tell about the game. So if you've been enjoying these podcasts, it would be an awesome way for you to say thank you. Okay, that's enough from future Hannah. Now I'm going to throw it to past Hannah to kick off the show proper.
Those questions, especially like the nature of reality kind of thing, those are also the questions that I ask in my own work. Seeing reality for what it is, I think, is something that all art has the aim of doing, because it's something, art is about conveying a truth.
Hello and welcome to One Cool Thing, a podcast from indie game studio Die Gute Fabrik, hosted by me, Hannah Nicklin. One Cool Thing is a podcast speaking with people in and around video games about one cool thing not from games, which is really grabbing their attention right now. I'm going to introduce them, their practice, talk about the one cool thing they've brought to the conversation, and together we'll consider how it's shaping how they think about their work. It's a chance to hear more about the practices of cool folks working in games, and hopefully somewhere where we can all reflect on how we think about how we make things. So, without further ado, let me introduce our guest. Matthew Seiji Burns is a writer, director, composer, and game designer based in Seattle on the west coast of the USA. You think that would be enough for one person? But as I delved deeper into his credits, I also found a ton as a producer too. All in all, Matthew has worked on games as varied as AAA games like Halo 3, to high-concept indies like Eliza, as part of his long-standing collaboration with Zachtronics, and on high-impact yet tiny works of interactive fiction like The Writer Will Do Something or The Arboretum. The Writer Will Do Something is so instructive, in fact, that I wrote a whole bit about it in my book, Writing for Games. He has a 6-record back catalogue on Bandcamp with Zachtronics. And speaking of Zachtronics, I personally loved Eliza. I really recommend checking that out. It traces this sort of burnt out programmers' ethical quandaries around their work being used in an AI-driven mental health care setting, which is just increasingly more relevant, scarily so perhaps. The character-driven dialogue in particular was of a level you don't always find in sort of game settings where you sort of have to prioritize so many things. There's no way I'm standing here saying all games writing is bad. I'm not that person, but it sometimes does suffer because of other priorities. And that is absolutely not true of Eliza, where it is spot on. And the voice acting is also really special there. The Writer Will Do Something is also just this perfect tool for communicating the often tough and contradictory spot that story professionals are placed in within games practices, which is sort of related to what I just said. So, well, okay, that's a lot of kind of introducing you there, Matthew, but we also find you a really interesting place in your practice right now, presumably, because in 2022, Zachtronics announced that the studio was being gently wound down, right?
That's correct, yes. It's certainly an interesting time for me right now, where I'm kind of thinking about what I'm doing next. I've been working on some things, some non-Zachtronics things, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about that stuff soon. But it's definitely something that is uncharted territory for me and for Zach and the rest of the team. We're still in touch and working together on some things, but also going our own ways in other ways.
Yeah, a real privilege to sort of come and chat with you at this sort of crossroads, the changing point in your practice, and to talk about such an interesting subject. But before I ask you to introduce that, I wonder if there was anything that you wanted to clarify or correct about your introduction, add to anything.
No, I think that that does a very good job of covering it. I've found it hard to introduce myself because I could either say a whole lot or I can just kind of say hello. And I always feel like I'm going on about myself too much if I try to cover everything. So that was really, that was actually very nice to hear. So
good.
Thank you.
Okay, so I wonder if you want to introduce what you've brought in as your one cool thing.
Yes, so my one cool thing is something that I call Two Visions of Zen. And it is about interest in Zen from the West, particularly America, in the late 60s and throughout the 70s.
The other day I explained what is sound. Sound is different from noise. Sound is, something which comes out more real and which comes out from your practice is sound.
This has to do with two Zen teachers who came to San Francisco, both in the late 60s. One of them was Shunryu Suzuki from Japan.
The noise is more objective being. The sound is both objective and subjective. So,
and the other was a monk named Xuanhua from China.
念楞引咒啊，是增加你的智慧，增加你的善根，增加你的福慧。
They were both representatives of the Zen tradition, which is a tradition within the larger tradition of Buddhism. And yet, in many ways, they couldn't have been more different. And to me, this is just a fascinating time of history and a fascinating contrast. There are all these sort of people of a certain generation, hippies, maybe you could call them, who were really interested in Eastern philosophy. And then across town in San Francisco, you could either go to, the Shunryu Suzuki's San Francisco Zen Center, or you could go to the Gold Mountain Temple, which was the Chinese Zen temple.
So I'm going to zoom us out before we zoom in on why this sort of subject is really interesting to you. And I'm going to note that this is an area which is super new to me. So we're definitely going to lean on your expertise here. But just for the listeners who might not have come across Zen Buddhism or just sort of heard the term Zen thrown around colloquially, but not necessarily know what it's connected to. We're talking about two visions of a version of Buddhism, which is in itself already a particular version or sect of Buddhism. So Zen itself is already a certain vision, which is really generally speaking focused on meditation. So Buddhism as a whole is a tradition with over 5 million followers, which traces the teachings of the Buddha. And Zen in turn is a practice-based form of Buddhism, which is less about the doctrine, actually, I don't think I've ever said that word out loud, and more about the learning and developing of a practice of Buddhism through meditation. Do you feel like that's an okay summary?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the interesting things about Zen itself is that it kind of comes about as maybe something of a rebellion against overly doctrinal focused teachings and dogma, and is more about kind of finding the immediate truth in things in the moment, and sort of throwing away all the old books and kind of renewing that sense of immediacy. And it starts quite early. I think kind of some of the earliest Zen stuff is found maybe around, I want to say like 400 to 600 AD is when kind of the first records of that kind of teaching are first discovered.
And I wonder if you could situate it in the world as a practice or as a religion. Where does it originate? I mean, obviously these countries didn't exist back then, but as we know now.
Yeah. So it kind of, Buddhism originally comes from northern India and made its way up into China. And Zen is very kind of associated with the Chinese version of Buddhism. And there's obviously a lot of historical kind of debates and argument about where things specifically come from. Do they originate in China? Do they originate in India? There's a certain amount of nationalistic feeling that comes out in these debates, and the history isn't always clear, and it goes back and forth, just like a lot of these types of topics. But from China, Zen went to Japan, of course, and then from China and Japan in the modern world, we see Zen almost around us every day, in terms of like, if you go to the spa or something, you'll see a poster on the wall that says "Find your Zen" or something, and it'll show a person doing a yoga pose or something like that, right? We always talk about our moments of Zen, or like it's become a sort of a popular culture thing today, which is also very interesting.
Yeah. And so let's sort of zoom a little bit closer into your subject then. And just to situate it in time and space, these two visions of Zen, we're talking San Francisco in the 1960s, right? You sort of touched upon hippies in your introduction. And we literally mean hippies. We mean the original hippies and beatniks, who were sort of very often, in a place where they were open to new subcultures and new sort of practices and beliefs, right? Let's talk about these two Zen masters, though. So we've got Shunryu Suzuki of Japan and Xuanhua of China, both of whom came over to San Francisco in the 1960s. I wonder if you could start by summarizing these two visions. I mean, obviously, it's going to be a huge topic, but let's find a starting point.
Yes. So getting into this is a huge topic, but some of this comes down to the difference between Chinese Buddhism and Japanese Buddhism. They are, ostensibly the same religion and the same school of the same religion, but there are some pretty huge differences when you get down to it. Shunryu Suzuki's version of Buddhism is kind of steeped in the Japanese Buddhist tradition, and there are some very concrete differences between Japanese and Chinese Buddhist monks. One is that Japanese Buddhist monks are allowed to get married and have children, and they often pass down the abbotship of their temples to their firstborn sons, so it's hereditary. Chinese monks are celibate, and so they are not allowed to have children, or they usually don't have children. Japanese monks sometimes don't follow some of the Buddhist rules. They eat meat or they drink, both of which are forbidden in many forms of Buddhism. There's a lot of like back and forth about what the rules actually are, but I think many people would say that those are two pretty strong ones. So like a lot of the Zen monks of his time, Shunryu Suzuki was someone who didn't, forbid his students from necessarily doing certain things like that. Whereas Xuanhua was very much steeped in this Chinese tradition of being very strict and following these ancient rules: no smoking, no drinking, no drugs, no meat, nothing like that. And so the immediate difference between these two teachers is that one is very permissive and much more about the kind of the intellectual aspects of Zen. And then the other is about representing a tradition and carrying that tradition forward almost exactly as it had been in medieval China, and sticking to those rules, almost dogmatically.
And was there a sense of either of these catching on more than another? Because obviously you think of the era of the 60s and the 70s, and you think that perhaps the more permissive vision of Zen might be the more attractive. But that's me with the stereotypes I have of the era. Maybe there were equally as many people looking to cling to new traditions.
That's right. Yeah, this is one of the reasons it's really fascinating to me, is because yes, you would immediately think, well, the more permissive teacher is the one that's going to catch on. And I think that does happen in a way. I think that like the version of Zen that Shunryu Suzuki promulgated is the one that is more kind of in our cultural kind of soup today. Like we think of Zen as this kind of very airy, kind of mysterious, intellectual, meditative exercise, whereas the one that Xuanhua promulgated, I think, is much more today, is sort of adhered to by people who were already kind of had a very strong religious background, and so it's not in the cultural conversation as much. But you would be surprised, because I think that like there are people who are attracted to having a very strict set of rules and very strict set of practices to follow. Sometimes people want that or even crave that in their lives, right? They want to be told like, this is good and this is bad, and you absolutely have to do this. And sometimes people really want that. And so you see the kinds of people who are attracted to Xuanhua's teachings were people who, one of the books written by one of his students, he talks about he grew up Catholic and going to like a school run by nuns and things like that. And I think that sort of very strict discipline made sense to him in a way. And so he was able to exist at the monastery as well. A different set of rules, different tradition, but a similar sensibility.
Absolutely. And both of those things can be a stepping away from the monoculture of the America at the time, or the white colonizing Christian kind of monoculture, I suppose. I'm describing there, because you can turn away from one tradition and look for other structures and other authorities and absolutes, or you can turn away and look for something which is more ineffable and more sort of subjective, maybe is the word that I'm looking for. Really interesting to get this introduction from you. I'm interested also in how this topic first captured you. Is this something that you've known about for a long time? Were you brought up in either of these traditions, or is this something you discovered sort of later in life and are just really fascinated with?
It's actually kind of a mix of both of those things. So my father was one of the people who was interested in Buddhism in the late 60s and 70s. He was in San Francisco at the time, and he studied Buddhism. He was kind of in that hippie world. He was originally from Rhode Island, from a kind of a middle-class family, and was, like a lot of the people of his generation, felt that there wasn't a lot for him in his own cultural traditions, and kind of was looking for something that really got to the heart of how he felt, got to the heart of, what it means to be alive or be human or whatever. And so he ended up studying Buddhism pretty seriously for a while before I was born. And then what happened was I was growing up, and we had these kind of Buddhist books lying around the house from his time when he was studying that. He didn't tell me to about Buddhism. He wasn't didactic about it or anything like that, but the books were there. And as a young budding writer, I was just kind of, when you're a kid, you just devour any books that are available to you, right? So I just read anything, as you do. And so I read those books, and I remember liking them pretty well. But then I grew up, and you start worrying about your, you worry about school, and then you worry about your career. And so it was another 20, 25 years before I was like, I was heads down working so much in my career. And then I said, I got to a little bit older, and then I was like, what am I doing? Is this all there is? And all these kind of midlife questions that start to come up. And that is when I started to renew my interest in this kind of stuff, both the philosophy and also kind of the practicalities of implementing that philosophy. And so I started reading again about all of this stuff. And honestly, beyond just the Buddhist philosophy itself, the details of how it filters through society to me are just endlessly fascinating, and the history of it and where it goes. So that is how I came to kind of being really interested in this topic.
So I feel like I have to, as a responsible host, ask if your father was in a particular school, if he was like clearly Xuanhua, or if he was Shinryu Suzuki kind of school of Buddhism.
Right. So my father was actually in the Xuanhua school for a while. So he followed the very strict rules for quite a while, which is interesting because after he stopped going there, I remember him as just a very normal kind of dad person. Like he sort of reintegrated back into society quite a bit. He drank and ate meat and hung out with the guys and grilled like a dad, and
had a child.
And had a child, right? Yeah. So he never really talked about that period of his life when he was following these very strict rules, which is also another kind of fascinating thing for me. But yeah, he studied the Chinese language, and he had a bunch of Chinese language like flashcards that he had made himself when he was a young man, and had gone on a whole kind of pilgrimage trip with another person from the same school. So it was clearly something very important to him at the time, and yet growing up in suburban Los Angeles in the 80s, I almost never heard about it. And so rediscovering this history has been kind of a really interesting journey for me.
And have you since had a chance to talk more with your dad about that time?
Yeah, I have, and it's interesting. The perspective that I have on it, kind of from just reading books. Really, I haven't really done an actual. I'm not much of an organized religion person myself, right? So all of this for me is just reading, and then his memory of things is really interesting, because he remembers things in such a particular way of not necessarily being a big deal. And then I read about the things, and they seem like a pretty big deal to me. like sitting up is like a thing that you could do if you meditated so much. You could just meditate for X number of hours, and you would not lie down on the ground, and that's like something that you a level that you could get to in your meditation practice.
Wow.
And it just surprised me so much. And he was like, yeah, I did that once or twice. I don't know. He was very kind of downplaying it.
So, okay. So let's sort of pull back again, go back into the 1960s. Was there a sense of rivalry between Shunryu Suzuki and Xuanhua's followers or practices, or were they both just sort of open alternatives?
Yeah. So this is one of the things where I absolutely sensed a pretty not out in the open overt, because everyone is supposed to be very Buddhist and nice, right? But in the writings from the time, because I love original sources, right? So I love reading I'll go and find the newsletter that they had from the time that they were writing, and things like that, because it's just so great to hear things in their own voice, when they were feeling those things. And to be quite honest, I think there was a lot of snippy comments, kind of, especially I think maybe from the side of the of Xuanhua's students, who felt, because that they were doing these very strict practices and following these very strict rules, that the students of Shunryu Suzuki were not as serious, because that they were more casual, and they were not really getting the real heart of Zen. They were just kind of doing this fake version of it. But it's funny, because this is one of those things where my dad is like, oh, I don't really remember it being like that. But when I go back and I read the kinds of things that people were writing, that sense is absolutely there.
This is really, I don't know, sometimes when I listen to these conversations with folks, learning about a thing, these little things pop up from my own life, so I try and identify with them, understand them. And the straight edge punk community just came into my head.
Yes, yeah.
And I just remember the really straight edge people just being really snippy about the people who were just straight edge light,
Absolutely. It's absolutely like that. And that's one of the things that makes it so funny to me and interesting, is that there's a lot of parallels to so many other things.
So you spoke a little bit earlier about how these two schools of Buddhism have kind of filtered through into sort of now, and how they have impacted just culture in general in the States, maybe on the West Coast in particular. I wonder if you could just expand on that a little bit.
Sure. Shunryu Suzuki invited another monk to America named Kobun Chino, and so he was an associate of Shunryu Suzuki's. And Kobun Chino was very famously the Zen monk who advised Steve Jobs a few times, and there is a real kind of Zen to Silicon Valley pipeline, I'll say, where a lot of these kinds of early Silicon Valley founders in around this time were influenced by these ideas. And so in the history of California and all of the kind of, like you said, the West Coast, like intellectual tradition of these kinds of things, there is a real detectable strain of that kind of thought filtering in through technology companies. And so when you think of like Apple design today, and it's sort of like minimalist and the, you know, the function and the form are inseparable and things like that, I think there's a real traceable lineage back to certain ideas of Zen aesthetics. You know, when you look at like the perfectly flat face of a new iMac or whatever, right? Some of those things are you can definitely trace a line back to that kind of thinking.
Super interesting. I remember way back when I was PhDing, reading Brenda Laurel's Computers as Theatre, and her talking about the necessary invention of metaphor in order to make computers readable to the public, right? And she talked a lot about the nature metaphors of kind of that era of talking about surfing the web and like those kinds of things. And do you know what, that it just makes such a clear connection also to like the, I don't know, yeah, just that kind of relationship, that minimalism, it's all mixed into there, that kind of relationship. And the creating of a language for a new means of communicating, super interesting, like visually and philosophically as well as like linguistically.
Yeah, absolutely.
And do you see similar influences from like Xuanhua in?
I think that his influence, you know, maybe to the chagrin of some of his Western students, is not as great in today's society, because his you know, his teachings were so much more conservative in a way, and in a way that were not necessarily as adaptable to just normal kind of American lives, right? It's amazing to me to think about Xuanhua, because hippies were walking into this Buddhist monastery in like, it's like imagine it's 1972 and you're like want to learn about Buddhism and be a hip cat or whatever they would say, and then you come in and there's this guy who's saying, yeah, no alcohol, no tobacco, no marijuana, no other drugs, nothing, just meditate, eat one meal a day if you're cool. If you're not cool, maybe you'll eat 2 meals a day. Vegetarian. We have no money, so a lot of it, like, we use like every part of the vegetable. We go dumpster diving to find food. Like, you know, early on they would do stuff like this. So it's wild to me to imagine, you know, people showing up at the hippies showing up at this monastery and then being told this. And so I think that like Xuanhua's vision for Buddhism, if you look at it today, it falls under the category of kind of a religion that serves a certain minority population. Most of the monasteries and temples that are associated with his movement, most of the language is in Chinese. There are some Vietnamese, and just a very small number of Westerners. Whereas I think the Shunryu Suzuki's Zen and kind of Japanese Zen in general, and to a lesser extent, there's also Tibetan Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism as well, have spread quite a bit in kind of American society. Not only is there a lot of Zen meditation centers in almost every city, but you also see kind of like the Theravada meditation tradition also taking off. Silicon Valley founders today talk about doing Vipassana meditation, which is a Theravada tradition. It's different from Zen, different branch. But those kinds of things are here because they've been adapted to American realities and kind of, Western world realities. And they've been adapted quite a bit, because if you go back and look at the traditions, there's so much that they don't tell you to do, so many rules and other things.
Although there's also the theory of influence, isn't there, that you should treasure your radicals. So perhaps without the Xuanhua kind of vision of Buddhism, the alternative might not have seemed as attractive. I don't know, like that,
Right.
like
Right.
like the theory of change is that if you're, for example, you're someone maybe on the left, but maybe not like going out and gluing yourself to roadways in order to protest the investment in new oil powered projects in the UK. Like the position I always personally think is that you should treasure your radicals because they push the needle in that direction, and the needle is not on that left, and the closer it gets there, the closer that you are to, I mean, I would consider myself one of the gluing people, but like it's a theory of influence, which perhaps the Xuanhua school like was played a part in. I wonder if you could, so if the Shunri Suzuki school is the one that perhaps has had the sort of stronger staying power because, as you say, it's made these adaptations or concessions to North American kind of Western culture. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the practice of that kind of school of Buddhism looks like today, as like what has survived of it.
Mm-hmm. I think, like you said at the beginning, really the most important thing in my view is meditation, and the meditation practice is the heart of Zen. It's what the word Zen actually means, is a meditative state. And like what the things that I think it emphasizes today that respond to people are kind of learning to live in the moment and learning to be what everyone calls mindfulness now, which is understanding that you're existing at a very particular moment in time, and that they're really, according to your actual senses, there isn't really anything else other than this particular moment in time. And so if you are remembering something or imagining something, just be aware that that's what you're doing. That helps so much with things, if you're going to be anxious about something that's coming up in the future, well, it hasn't happened yet. So, and if you're kind of angry about something that happened in the past, well, that's your memory of it. And so learning to kind of like see your mind at work. This is one of the great things that meditation does, is it lets you see your brain do things. And you're like, that's why I feel really bad all the time. Not that it's that simple or easy, of course, but I think that the practical aspect of that is, what is still beneficial about it and what survives, or what I would hope to be the thing that survives.
And in the context of Zen Buddhism, it isn't the perhaps the sort of cherry-picked vision of kind of wellness culture. Mindfulness is centered on the self in a way that is perhaps a little disconnected from the Buddhist form of it, which is not just about connecting with yourself, but about connecting with yourself in the context of the world and others, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit tricky because Zen, does a lot of work to try to it does a lot of work to kind of say like everything is an illusion, but it also does a lot of work to say, but that doesn't mean nothing exists, because it's very easy to read just a little bit of Zen and go, oh, everything's an illusion, nothing exists, right? And so I think some people like catch on that and believe that nothing is real is the teaching of Zen, and it's not, because there's a lot of Zen that says, hey, the world is real and you have to be like good and you have to make real decisions and you have to do all this stuff. That moral component of Buddhism is huge, and yet that's the one that's kind of like least developed here, right? I think in Asia, the moral component is tremendously important, and obviously it's like forms the basis for the moral code of a lot of just whole societies, and is very strict in a lot of ways, and something that I personally wouldn't be very interested in, just to be clear about where I am on this. But those moral codes are also like very an important part of this whole system. And sometimes that gets lost here because people aren't, if you're like, why am I feeling bad, or why am I having a midlife crisis? And you go to the temple and the monk comes out and he says, well, just stop drinking, like that's not, I don't know that that's the most helpful thing or the most popular thing. Maybe it is helpful, but it's not something that like people are going to latch onto, I think, very strongly.
So you've taken us on a wonderful journey as to thinking about how both Xuanhua and Shunryu Suzuki might be the reason that our computer interfaces work the way that they do, or feel that the way that they do. But I wonder if we could turn now to the sort of second half of the conversation, which is, how does this one core thing impact you and how you think about how you work? I mean, it doesn't have to impact the work directly. It can just be something that informs you and how you think. But I wonder if you wanted to expand on that more.
Yeah, I mean, I think its effect is pretty it's pretty big, and it's also a little bit hard to elucidate because it's kind of shot through everything that I do. But really, if you ask me, the heart of Buddhism is kind of like asking the big questions about like why we're here and what is the point of the world, and like what is reality, seeing reality for what it is, I think is one of the most urgent and important questions of Buddhist philosophy. How to stop suffering is sort of the big spiritual pitch of Buddhism. Like if you're suffering, you can follow this spiritual practice and feel better. Those kinds of things, those questions, especially like the nature of reality kind of thing, those are also the questions that I ask in my own work. And seeing reality for what it is, I think, is something that all art, all great art, or all art that especially I respond to, but I suspect maybe all art has the aim of doing, because it's something, art is about conveying a truth to me. Whatever that truth may be, it's about conveying something. And so the Buddhist tradition, like every other great world tradition of culture and religion, has been in this business of trying to convey a truth for thousands of years. And they've come up with some really, really ingenious solutions for it over many thousands of years. And so immersing yourself in a tradition is just such a great way to get a lot of interesting ideas, just fascinating ideas. And again, if you go back and you read original sources, many of them are being translated now, which is terrific. And you can just find all kinds of weird, interesting, amazing things to be inspired by.
And that sense of art being a means of reflecting on reality, I think somewhere between Kant and Husserl, I remember reading the concept of bracketing, which is that the purpose of art being to not replicate what is real, but to frame what is real.
Mm-hmm.
To put like a proscenium arch in front of it, or a frame around it which says, this is real, but let's look at it.
Mm-hmm.
And you're sort of subsumed in it every day. It's hard to pay attention to it, but a proscenium arch or a frame asks you to think about it and look at it and reflect on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that this is also a big political kind of thing I have against immersion as an aim for art, because it's kind of a washing away. It asks you not to reflect. It asks
right.
you to think. And personally, I find the most effective works are anti-immersive, are sort of, even if they're trying to portray a very real reality, offer you a space for reflection in them as well. And it feels to me that the meditation is very much that, right? That the practice you've described is of going, I'm in this, but also let's think about how I'm in this.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that, I spoke about meditation earlier as a way to kind of step back and watch your own brain do things, and watch your own brain kind of spin up new worries that it didn't have before. And you're like, wow, I just made that up in my head, right? Like, that's a great thing about meditation. And that's, I think, what I would love to do with games, is give people a space to reflect, right? This is something that in Eliza I tried to do, which was like set up these situations and then allow you to think about what they mean and give you the space to kind of like think about this situation and play with these kind of different scenarios in your head. To me, that's a huge promise of like interactive narrative.
And I feel like the design of choice in Eliza feels super elegant as well. Like it's while the story world is extremely sort of well drawn and convincing and asks you to lean in and is telling quite an authored thing. It also offers quite a stark choice towards the end, and that choice, because there aren't so many choices that feel like they're going to change things. The choices are more about painting things in the run up to those sort of ending choices. It feels like those choices are that moment to go, what do you think though? What do you think? Not just what do you want for this character, but like, how do you weigh the needs of this character with the needs of the world that this is painted, which is just like a really elegant piece of narrative design with choice in like not like in using it so sparingly that when it comes like a bell ringing.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I wanted to try to do, was kind of use the negative space of a choice, right? And say that like for a long time you don't have a choice, and then when you do, it feels more momentous, you know, when you finally do get a choice. That was one of the aims.
In my head canon, I refused the choice, by the way.
Yeah.
Like I take a look at sort of played through and took a look at the endings, but in my head canon, I was like, I would make a different choice that is not provided here. In my head canon, I stopped here because I'm just one of those really difficult players. We've heard a little bit there about how sort of this sort of one core thing sort of is affecting you and your work and your practice. Is there anything else you want to sort of offer from your own practices before we move on to thinking about like what you'd like to offer the audience, the listening audience, with regards to the cool thing?
I think that, you know, one of the things that this journey has given me over the course of my life is just a sense of how a lot of the perennial questions that we ask ourselves, human beings, we've been asking these questions for as long as at least anybody's been able to write anything down. And so some of the earliest writings ever that are still preserved are these existential questions about why are we here? What do we do about it? Why do I feel bad all the time? And what can I do about it? Why is the world punishing me? And things like that. And so when you feel bad and then you go back and you kind of read some of these original sources and people are talking about the same thing 2,000, 2,500 years ago, it's very, very interesting. And there are also just so many incredible, inspiring things to find when you go outside of the Western tradition as well. There are so many fantastical things in these works. Stories of gods and ghosts and all kinds of other things that are really like, if you're not used to, for example, the Chinese tradition of all of that kind of stuff, it's very, very inspirational, I think, to immerse yourself in that kind of tradition, and you'll be inspired not just from like a philosophical Buddhist, like, oh, don't get attached to the world kind of way, but just all kinds of wacky things that you would never think of, and funny things too. One of the things that happens in some of the earliest Buddhist scriptures that come from India is someone dies because they're kicked by a cow. And it's just like such a weird, I don't know, for me it was like almost like a laugh out loud moment. And it happens more than once. Like it was a real danger in ancient India to be kicked by a cow and then just literally die from it. So it's like weird details like that come out when you read original sources. I know that like in the Western classical tradition, you can read like Herodotus and stuff and find all kinds of just weird and strange things. And they're just so, you can use all that stuff in the things that you're doing. It's tremendous.
And if you were to recommend a sort of starting point for a listener sort of new to the world of Zen or these particular two schools of Zen Buddhism, what would you recommend?
Oh my goodness. I don't really that's a tough one. I would say you can start almost anywhere because it's just an ocean of information. And if you just pick any kind of book about it and just start following the threads that are interesting to you, I think you'll go on a real amazing journey. And if you're not interested in one aspect of it, that's fine because there's so much else. So literally just pick any book and get started and follow the thread.
I even had a great time just hopping onto Wikipedia and then seeing like what was linked from there. So maybe it's as simple as that.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. Okay. Wonderful. Well, you told me you could talk for hours and hours about this, and we've done our best to try and keep it to a neater amount of time. But if people were to follow you in other places on the internet, or is there anything at the moment that is out that you wish sort of for people to go and take a look at? Where would they go?
So my website is matthewseiji.com, MatthewSeiji. I'm also that username on Twitter and some of the other things that are trying to replace Twitter at the moment. So you can find me on the usual, I would say, social networks under that name. I don't have anything new to talk about at the moment, but I hope to have something before long. But if you want to check out Eliza, it's on Steam and on the Switch as well. It's a visual novel, and I would be thrilled if you took a look at it.
Yeah, I can't recommend Eliza enough. It's just a really, really brilliant, kind of very well made, well held together piece of work. Really, really excellent. So yeah, do go find Eliza and follow Matthew as Matthew Seiji on all of those different platforms. Otherwise, I'm just going to sort of wrap us up there, unless there's any sort of lasting thing that you want to leave us with.
I just want to say it's been a pleasure being here, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being with us. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of One Cool Thing from Die Gute Fabrik. As usual, leave that rating or review where you can. It really matters. If this time is of value to you, it's a really good way to say thank you. Another thing to mention is that we're delighted to say that our next major game project at Die Gute Fabrik is now announced. Saltsea Chronicles. It's a flooded world, brand new story-driven adventure game where you investigate a mystery as a ship's whole crew. It represents a real step up in storytelling ambition from our last title, Mutazione, but it's still beautifully designed and animated, and with what I honestly believe is some world-class storytelling. Wishlist Saltsea Chronicles on Steam right now and head to saltseachronicles.com to find out more. I'll be back soon with a new episode speaking with another cool thinker and maker in the field of video games, and in the meantime check out Die Gute Fabrik on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube and now TikTok. I don't run the TikTok, Unaming does. She's much better at it than I would be. You can find us in all those places as GUTEFABRIK, Gute Fabrik. This podcast was produced, edited, and sound designed by Tom Wally. Additional production and research by Unaming Kavanagh. Our theme music is by Nick Ellis, whose music you can find under the name of 10B on Bandcamp. That's TENBY. Stay thoughtful, friends. Take care. Goodbye.